Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 24. This is episode 1 of a two-part series about Professor Eugene Hilgard from the University of California and the experimental stations that he spearheaded in the late 1800s. Today, we will be focusing on the background of the stations, how they came to be, what they hoped to accomplish, and dive in deeper to the Foothills Experimental Station near Jackson in Amador County. When the next part is published, we'll discuss the other stations. Although I note in the episode, I feel like it's worth stressing that these were agricultural experiment stations, not purely viticulture. Although, as we'll see next time, there were a few that were strictly concerned with viticulture. Here we go. Working from California outward. It is idle to pretend at this late hour that blind imitation is to be preferred to the intelligent application of principles that hold good under all circumstances, and that we have only to plant the same vines and follow the same modes of operating practiced in the old world in order to produce similar vintages, when the climatic conditions under which we operate are radically different, as are also our soils. That's Professor Eugene Hilgard, working for the University of California, 1889. As early as the first annual report by the State Board of Viticulture Commissioners, it was recommended for California to have at least one experiment station, 40 to 50 acres where every grape variety they had available could be planted and studied for growth, production, disease, and quality. At least 100 vines of each, ideally, so cuttings can be gathered and distributed, and everyone could agree on a singular name for each grape. Most likely, these thoughts started much earlier. Arpad Harasti, president of the board, put those thoughts in writing and went further. This would be one of the greatest benefits that could be conferred upon the viticultural pursuit of the state. Then California would not have the shame of going to borrow her required knowledge from Missouri, Ohio, France, Spain, or Portugal, but would have knowledge of her own, and to spare. In the 1880s, Professor of Agriculture Eugene Hilgard, working for the University of California, oversaw new research stations around the state. Paso Robles, Tulare, Chino Valley, and Jackson in the Sierra foothills were some of the sites chosen for these research stations. During this expansion stage, these new stations would potentially give the university up to 10 research stations focusing on agriculture, viticulture, and forestry. Some of these other stations were privately run, including Western Santa Clara County, Eastern Santa Clara County, Oakville, and Fresno, and they came in and out of the system. Issues facing California wine at the time were the natural diversity of California as a state, both in soil and in weather. Many parts still relatively unexplored thoroughly. California was still very young, some areas just being opened up from the Rancho era. Phylloxera, a root louse that had devastated European vineyards and was spreading in California. A large amount of vine cuttings being imported into the state under proprietary names, incorrect names, or alternative names depending on country of origin. A new workforce of men fresh from the mines that might be looking for other work, and a majority of the wines being produced were low quality, flawed, and often fortified. The university set off to fix these. Hilgard rallied against the primitive conditions of California winemaking, the blending of any grape available, and what he called the go-as-you-please fermentation practices and producers blending anything they could to make a semblance of a wine. Additions of cherry or elderberry juice for color, excessive water to stretch a wine, excessive sugar additions or fortifications to make up for underripe grapes, excessive acid additions, glycerin, oak tannins, etc. are all on Hilgard's no list. Hilgard published over 1,250 pages of viticulture reports, but also routinely published bulletins that were shorter and could be published in daily or weekly newspapers around the state of California. The Jackson Station, also known as the Foothills Experiment Station, will be our focus today. Eugene Voldemar Hilgard was born in Germany in 1833. As a young child, his family immigrated to America, making the 2-month ocean voyage before landing in New Orleans. Eventually, the family worked their way up the Mississippi River before making their home in Illinois, in an area that had a large proportion of German immigrants. Stricken with malaria as a child and with his mother passing away when he was 9, life wasn't always easy, but young Eugene would educate himself on botany, chemistry, and physics with the help of his older sisters. On advice from doctors, he followed his older brother to Washington, D.C. in 1848 and was able to meet and hear lectures from respected scientists of the day in both D.C. and Philadelphia. During one of these trips, he followed the advice of James Curtis Booth at the Franklin Institute and decided to sail for Germany for analytical chemistry classes. After short stops in Zurich and Freiburg, Hilgard found himself back in Heidelberg, Germany, studying and eventually earning his Ph.D. in 1853 under Robert Bunsen. After another 2 years abroad, he returned to the U.S., Mississippi, working as a geologist and chemist before a short stint in Michigan. Hilgard moved from Michigan to California in 1875 to become the first professor of agriculture at the 8-year-old University of California, where he was known as one of the first to take a scientific viewpoint to agriculture. Hilgard had no professional viticulture or enology experience, but learned some practically from his father, who grew some grapes and was interested in the subject. As a member of the tasting committee at the Mechanics Institute of San Francisco in 1878, he expressed his thoughts that many wines were overripe, and he didn't especially care for the Mission or Zinfandel grapes from which they were made. Hilgard's battle was improving wine quality, even writing to the San Francisco Examiner with detailed plans to improve quality and receive higher prices for the resulting wines. It is high time that the ostrich-like policy of hiding the faults of our winemaking from ourselves were done away with once and for all, he wrote in the paper. He was against the flabby, higher alcohol and faulty wines often being served. He realized that California was too dependent on European farming, picking styles, and viticulture, that the California climate differs enough to warrant its own style of viticulture, and was against blind imitation of the old world. In addition to the experimental station work that we'll be concentrating on, he was also active in winemaking research, preferring cool fermentations for white wines, and running tests on the same must but with differing cap management styles and other scientifically conducted trials. During this time period, his wine of choice was Schramm's Burgundy, made with Refosco. Wine quality seems to be at the forefront in everything he was trying to accomplish at the university, and having California wine stand up with the best the world has to offer was his goal. His critiques of some of his contemporaries' wines could be blunt and to the point, replying to a Mr. Barton in Fresno, "If you desired no discussion of your products, save a favorable one, it was a mistake to send them to me, as the object of my work is to learn how to produce wines that will hold an honorable place under their own name anywhere in the world." Charles Wetmore of Livermore was an executive on the board of state viticulture commissioners, the same group that Arpad Harasti was the president of. The university side, led by Hilgard, and the state side, led by Harasti, diverged in their priorities nearly as soon as they were both established. Multiple things were at play here. The men on the board mostly thought of themselves as practical men who made good wine without any great difficulty or need for scientific understanding of the process. Hilgard, as we have already seen, saw this much differently. Wetmore could be dismissive of the young men working for the university, and Hilgard was disappointed that people were making wines that sold for 15 cents a gallon, where with a little more care these same wines could potentially sell for 30 cents a gallon. Wetmore believed in smaller wineries and that anyone could make wine. Hilgard wanted larger wineries with trained professional winemakers. They didn't agree on too much. Wetmore liked cultured yeast, Hilgard did not. Wetmore was in favor of higher alcohol wines, Hilgard lower. Wetmore and Hilgard also disagreed with Hilgard having a station at Berkeley infested with phylloxera to be able to study the root louse. It was planted about 30 miles from Wetmore's estate in Livermore that was still free of it. Phylloxera was first identified in California in 1873. It had probably arrived maybe a decade earlier, but spread a bit slower in California than in Europe. Their wings didn't develop as quickly here. In 1876, the first scientific report on this root louse was published by Hilgard. He originally suspected the Vitis californica would work as a resistant rootstock, but it did not. Phylloxera research was at the top of the list for UC agricultural professors and researchers at this time. Due to the other stations coming online and the difficulty in ripening grapes in Berkeley, during the spring of 1890, the vineyard of the central station was torn out in order to plant more olive trees. To continue research into phylloxera, a plot of infected vines was turned over to the university at the State Home for Feeble-Minded Children in Sonoma Valley. Hilgard in 1880, 81, and 82 solicited samples from various vintners and vineyardists. Contributing to the trials of these first couple years were, in 1880, Charles Krug, Zinfandel, Berger, Malvoisie, and General Nagley of San Jose and the Civil War contributed Pinot Noir. The next year, Gunlock of Sonoma and George West of Stockton sent samples also. Over the next few years, growers such as H.W. Crabb, Charles Lafranc, T.F. Eisen, and J.T. Doyle contributed their own samples. Around this time, grapes would be classified by their place of origin: Bordeaux, Burgundy, southern France, northern Italy, Rhenish, etc. The university had tried various styles of research previously. Seeds, scions, and plants had been distributed to volunteers for a small fee in order that they would report back their findings. Partnerships with commercial vineyards had also been tried, but it was found that the push and pull between experimentation research and commercial wine production didn't work all that well for either. With the passage of the Hatch Experiment Station Act in 1887, which provided funds to each state for experimental stations and a State Viticultural Commission, Hilgard was able to expand to Jackson, Tulare, Paso, and Chino Valley near LA. 2 more were turned over to the university when the Forestry Commission dissolved. These were in Chico and Santa Monica. The university maintained the first 4 out of the $15,000 annual grant of the Hatch Act. The 2 Forestry Commission sites were maintained with $2,500 provided yearly by California. Hilgard's stated goal was instruction, experimentation, and agricultural survey. Instruction to students both practical and lab-based, as well as theoretical and lectures. The instruction didn't stop with students, but was also offered to farmers and institutions, and included correspondence and answering questions that farmers might pose either in person or through letters. He was basing instruction on principles, not just process, believing hard work was needed as much as ever, but without the backing of science, it could never reach the pinnacle. In this, he's speaking of all agriculture, not just viticulture. Experimentation, of course, is the name of the project, and this often meant planting a wide variety of grapes, row crops, tree fruit, and more to find what thrives and fails in the different climates and soils of the state. California is nearly 1,000 miles long and 400 wide, with the geography and microclimates that can be bewildering. Ocean, and then the Coast Range of mountains on one side, the Sierra Nevada mountains on the other, a large valley in between, tectonic plates with millions of years difference in age butting up and grinding against each other, the highest and lowest points in the contiguous U.S., nearly viewable from each other. Hilgard wanted to experiment and see what would grow where, hence the geographic diversity of the stations. Agricultural survey. Hilgard wanted to know what soils were where. These experimental stations should represent the area they reside in as much as possible and have virgin soil in order to give a clean slate to the agricultural work. The only exception would be for fertilization trials. For these, they wanted at least partially depleted soils. The stations were not all based on viticulture, although it was prominent in most. Previously mentioned Berkeley Central Station was the first and oldest experimental station in the U.S. It was originally intended to test fertilizers for the grain that had been growing there for 30 years. In Tulare, and to a lesser extent Chino, there were experiments on growing crops in the alkali soils of the areas and reclaiming these soils in ways that would make them more suitable for agriculture. Sugar beets were one of the first crops they found success with, along with Australian saltbush as a forage food for cattle. Olives for oil production were another early success at Tulare, Paso, and Jackson. These stations would be staffed with scientifically minded foremen who could study if an apple was blossoming correctly for its variety, who could organize specimen collections, and with time help propagate new crossings for specific conditions. This research and the trials would save individual farmers from having to undertake it with their own time and money. Much thought was given to the locations, and areas whose agricultural identity wasn't yet known were moved to the front of the line. It was felt that they could work with individuals to trial specific plants in the more well-known areas if it was needed. Like we mentioned just a minute ago, the stations would be representative of their areas, especially as it pertains to climate and then to soil types. Stations weren't necessarily meant to be permanent. After 10 or 20 years, when it was discovered what could and could not be grown well there, a new location would take over that station's funds and the trials begin anew. Related to this is that Hilgard suggested the station locations be donated, held in trust, or leased instead of outright purchased by the university, and have a reversionary clause in case the station was later abandoned. He wasn't against permanent stations, but that was going to be the exception rather than the default. We'll see how this plays out later. A perpetual issue was money for the stations. Although the Hatch Act allowed $15,000 per year for the stations, only $3,000 total could be used for buildings on all the stations in their first year, and $750 per year after that. This was to limit the universities from putting up extensive and intricate housing and facilities, and limit it to only what was necessary. Hilgard complained that for a smaller eastern state with most likely one station, this amount would be sufficient, but for a state as large and varied as California, it would not be. He had previously divided the state into 5 sections based on what he called the National Agricultural Subdivisions. Number 1. The southern region from San Diego to Santa Barbara and out into the Mojave and Colorado deserts. Number 2, the San Joaquin Valley from the Tejon Mountains to Stockton. Number 3, the Sacramento Valley from Stockton north. Number 4, the Sierra Foothills from Fresno to Tehama County. Number 5, the Coast Range region. Land and funds were provided shortly by Amador County for the Jackson or Foothills Station, San Luis Obispo County for the Southern Coast Range Station, Tulare County for the San Joaquin Valley Station. And not long after, another offer came from National City. This would be the Southern Region Station. However, it was getting late in the fiscal year, and the money needed to be spent. The university felt that they would not be able to handle establishing more than 3 stations in that year. In all cases, multiple sites were presented to the university, and after touring each, they made their decisions. Hilgard also wished for localities that would provide free manpower, money, and infrastructure due to the funds he already felt were insufficient. October 1st of 1888 was a target goal to start the station's work. Foremen and their men had been training and working for months. The Foothills Station at Jackson was the second station after Berkeley, the largest, most remote, and most expensive, and the first to use the Hatch funds. The university was excited for its location being somewhat centrally located in the Sierra Foothills region. By this, I mean that it was a very remote station, but it wasn't as far south as Mariposa or as far north as Yuba, and they thought it could represent much of the region's climate and soil. Established with the initiative of A. Caminetti, a senator and former DA from Jackson in 1888, its highest point stood at 1,975 feet in elevation, and was about 4.5 miles northeast of Jackson in Amador County of the Sierra Foothills. The station was isolated, a mile from the nearest road, the roads in the area almost impassable in winter, and in other seasons it was several hours of hard riding in a stagecoach. This all kept casual visitors at bay. In the beginning, locals would occasionally picnic at the adjacent ranch, but that's about it. Having this mountain ranch allowed the Foothills Station to become closer to the modeled farm they envisioned. Nobody around to take up your time or make you feel compelled to have the best-looking flowers available for viewing, just farming and research. The findings would be presented to the farmers of the foothills in letters, written reports, and as fair exhibits. Again, due to the isolation of the area, it was felt the vegetable and fruit work was of special importance. No vegetable peddler from town could be expected to make the trip to all the isolated homesteads in the foothills, so a bountiful garden and orchard were a must for a completely self-sustaining way of life. Even in these early days, there were complaints about clearing the land. From George Hansen, the noted botanist and foreman of the Jackson Station, writing, "The low price of land in the Sierra foothills is offset by the expense of clearing the land when purchased. The chosen plots contain 3 of what were considered the most important soils in the foothills: red slate, quartz gravel, and granite. Manzanita, buckeye, pine, toyon, chaparral, poison sumac, and oaks. All kinds of oaks, black, white, blue, live, covered the property. Some were cut to a stump, some were pulled out whole, and some had their roots packed with blasting powder and then exploded. Multiple folks donated land to build this experiment station. The largest section of 22 acres came from Senator John Boggs of Colusa, an additional 6 on the west by Mr. McKay, and 7 on the north by Mr. Trabuco and Mr. Oneto. These provided some soil and exposures that were missing from the largest plot. The last plot was often called the Italian tract, and they did receive some compensation for stands of timber that were on the land. Eventually, 27 acres were under plow and bearing fruits, vegetables, trees, flowers, and grapes. Improvements were made that included grading 1.5 miles of road off of the nearby country road, putting a board and wire fence around the entirety of the station, building a 25,000-gallon reservoir, laying irrigation pipe from this reservoir, pump and water for the reservoir being supplied by the Amador Ditch Company. The ditch ran through the property. A 2-story home was built on the highest hill, looking down into the Sacramento Valley and able to see as far as Mount Diablo. Outbuildings, a barn, stables, greenhouses or propagating houses, and tool shop were also built. Even though irrigation was installed, the intent was to refrain from using it whenever possible so as to see what could thrive without it in this region. To arrive at the station, you would leave the main Jackson to Volcano stage line and take a side road at an elevation of 1,500 feet. Heading northwest, you would work your way through a winding ravine with another 330 feet of elevation gain before arriving at the main entrance to the station between 2 hills. Entering through the Aylward automatic gate, designed so you wouldn't have to dismount your horse or vehicle, you would find yourself on Olive Avenue, the olive trees lining both sides of the road, all types and shades of olives. You can continue on into the station, rising up to Fairview or Residence Hill on one side and Reservoir Hill on the other. The Amador Canal, or ditch, runs through the property, bringing water from the McCollumney River and the Sierra Nevada mountains down to the foothills. A small turbine wheel lifts it up for the water needs of the station, and a new bridge was built over the ditch to allow wagons to cross over into the McKay track on the opposite side of the canal. Citizenry of the surrounding towns were excited for the station. This is an area that only 40 years before had been overrun with people, mostly men from around the world, seeking fortunes in the gold fields. As the gold mines played out, they started looking around for what might be next. And they started looking around quicker once hydraulic mining was outlawed in the foothills. Agriculture brought to this area by the university would be very welcome for the future of the area. At the station's beginnings, much produce was still being shipped up from the valley below. The methods of farming were not always up to par as the miners switched professions. They do note that the best of the farmers in the area grew very good produce and made a good living from it, but much of the farming was haphazard. Charles Shin, inspector of the California Experiment Stations, stressed this point in many reports. The work of the Foothills Station continues to grow in importance. Amador, an old mining county, long retrograded after the exhaustion of the gold placers, is now entering a permanent agricultural prosperity. I love the picture he paints here. Like nearly all of the old mining districts, the mountain valleys illustrate the early horticulture and capabilities of the region. Old orchards of the deciduous fruit still stand in the midst of pastures. Old vines of mission grapes climb over the ruins of the miners' cabins. Old fig trees ripen their fruit for the quail and rabbits. The whole foothill country of the Sierra, from Tuolumne to Shasta, contains similar beginnings, now neglected and forgotten. Over time, the amount of visitors did in fact begin to grow, word getting out about what they were up to at the station. Sometimes 50 people a day would visit the station in its latter years, taking the train to Ione or Valley Springs, and then a stage to Jackson, the county seat. From there, you would hop aboard the Volcano Daily stage, which passed near the station. Most of the visitors were farmers from Tuolumne, Amador, Calaveras, El Dorado, or Placer counties. Benches and other seating were placed around the station for these visitors to take a load off. When it comes to viticulture, on the red soil there were 13 blocks. These were mostly hillside blocks around Reservoir Hill. They covered the southern, southeastern, and western exposures of the hill. On the north, where there was more granite mixed with the red soil, were another 6 blocks. And moving to the east side of the track were another 5 large blocks of new varieties. Contours of the land were used to provide the best exposure for the different grapes. Riesling in the cool areas, port grapes in the warmer. 46 varieties from cuttings and another 40 rooted ones were planted in the first round. Cuttings were given to all who requested them. The university only asked for the location, soil types, exposure, elevation, etc. in order to provide the most suitable material, but most seemed to want whatever would provide the largest crop. On the lighter hillside soils, many of the grapes for dry white wines disappointed or were eaten by animals, birds, and others before being harvested. It was guessed that most of the white wines might be for local consumption due to the remoteness of the station. They felt better wines could be made near the coast and cheaper wines could be made in the Central Valley. These were all dry farmed on hillsides, remember, and it was suggested that irrigation might make a large difference and bring high-quality white grape growing to this area. In the richer alluvial soils further down the hill, however, grapes fared much better. Claret Blanche, Semillon, Sauvignon Vert, Franken-Riesling, and Burger all showed much promise in producing a good-sized crop and a good wine. Dry red wines that showed promise included Malbec, Tannat, Gamay Teinturier, Serene, and Aramon. In fact, it was recommended that Aramon become the dominant grape, up to 2/3 of the vineyard, with Serene and Malbec making up the remainder. Verdelho, Boal, and of course Palomino were the choices for a sherry-type wine, and maybe a little Malvasia Bianca for a sweeter Muscat style. When it comes to port, Tinta Madeira was the hero, with some Mission and Grenache for higher quality. But it was warrant to only plant these last 2 where the object was to make a sweet wine. Cinsault and Ploussard were also highly recommended for table grapes. The university was sure that agriculture would take off in the foothills, writing that the station has shown the value and interest of this location for the future horticultural development of the Sierra foothills. And the substation is on the frontier and its observations have been strikingly new. Going on to say that its orchards and vineyards have scattered seeds, cuttings, and scions far and wide through the area, 4,000 to 5,000 a year on average, some even going to Hawaii, the Philippines, Arizona, and South America. Around 1898, a Native American reservation was established next to the station for the Jackson Band of Miwok Indians. It didn't seem to have too much of an effect on station life, but it was noted that more officials might be around and interested in the work the station was doing. A proposed electric railroad from Ione to Sutter Creek was an exciting development at the station also. It would allow you to take a train most of the way to Jackson, cutting down travel time immensely. Sadly, it never came to fruition. As late as 1901, Charles Shin wrote about the Foothills Station. Its possibilities are great, and it will be many years before they are exhausted. Gardens were still being expanded and new buildings erected. The end for Jackson and Paso Robles came in 1903. 1906 for Pomona and Tulare. The stations were closed without mourners. Like so much else, it all came down to money. And even worse, not having money. I think Hilgard says it best. Their chief crime was poverty, which restricted their undertakings, reduced their custodians to caretakers, and made it impossible to even aim at results of wide significance. It was expected that research would be continued by individuals in their localized area after the university abandoned the stations. Over 50 years passed with memories of the stations fading away. Hilgard became an emeritus professor in 1906. In the early 1950s, Hans Jenny of the university was the first to seek out the once thriving station. Jenny was one of the premier soil scientists, especially in the formation of soils. While writing his book, E.W. Hilgard and the Birth of Modern Soil Science, his wife and he were able to piece together the clues and track down the location of the station. Roads overrun with olive trees, long unpruned vines scattered around, old orchards with some trees hanging on, and a coast redwood that doesn't belong in the foothills. No house. No barn. The house had always been an issue. The locals wanted it on top of that highest hill, but it was exposed to the winds and rains up there and had to be constantly repaired and updated. He did find an empty 25,000-gallon stone-lined reservoir, too. Austin C. Goheen was a plant pathologist who joined the university in 1956, working with the USDA. He was instrumental in Foundation Plant Services, or FPS, and the work of the university in identifying viruses, cleaning up vines, and variety identification. He was also the license holder for the vine importation permit and started the system of clonal naming still in use today. Many of the vines being imported from Europe at the time were virused, and he suspected this might have to do with them being grafted onto the phylloxera-resistant rootstocks. He was on the hunt for clean, virus-free vines. In 1961, his interesting story started in the small town of West Point in Calaveras County. It's about 15 miles from the station. The owner, a Mr. C.T. Smith, had a small mission vineyard free of leaf roll, which was very unusual at the time. Smith informed Goheen that the cuttings came from a strange planting in Amador County, but wasn't sure what else was planted there or if anything was still in the ground. After checking with the agricultural commissioner and farm advisor for Amador County, Goheen learned that this mysterious planting was an abandoned University of California experimental station. In 1963, when the identity of the vineyard was revealed, he learned that a Mr. Fantozzi owned the land now. He was a stonemason in Jackson. Fantozzi was incredibly suspicious of this man from the university when Goheen came poking around his property, asking to inspect some vines. Eventually, it came to light that Fantozzi inherited this plot from his parents, who had been squatters on the land, and eventually earning the rightful title. Remember that this land was supposed to return to the donors or their heirs if the university abandoned it. It's unknown when the family moved onto the property, but they did, and had been there long enough that when heirs of the donors put in a claim, they lost to the Fantozzis. Someone, it's assumed the donors' heirs, burned down the buildings and raided the property. The trees and vines still stood, however, but another group abandoned the station when the Fantozzis moved to Jackson. Everything grew on top of everything else: trees, vines, flowers, and the native shrubs and grasses until you could just barely make out the rows that used to be there. This wasn't the first abandoned homestead in the hills Goheen had come across, so he had seen some of these things before. The agricultural commissioner we heard about earlier, Mr. Brown, was able to convince Mr. Fantozzi that Mr. Goheen was only interested in vines and had no ulterior motive for the property. Goheen was able to make out some rows and took cuttings from what he could. Back at the lab in Berkeley, they were propagated. Going through the university archives, Goheen was able to find a map of the original station and the grapes planted. This let him at least have an idea of the cuttings he was to grab next. On some blocks, this was easy, as they were still laid out exactly like the drawings. On others, there was much die-off and nature had actively taken over. 132 cultivars were eventually found. At one point, because of the overgrowth, they were 3 rows off, so the Herbamont sample Goheen cut, a vine originally from Texas, turned out to be Sauvignon Blanc. The majority of the grapes were free from diseases once tested in the laboratory. Only 18% had leaf roll virus, and fan leaf and other viruses were nearly absent. Many of these are now available through FPS. Some of the FPS selections from the Jackson Vineyard include Cabernet Sauvignon Clone 6, Cinsault Clone 3, Mission Clones 11 and 13, Negrette Clone 4, and Sauvignon Blanc Clone 29. In all, 117 cuttings were brought back to the university nearly virus-free. In 1976, Hans Jenny and his wife Jean revisited the site and spoke with Mrs. Kate Fantozzi. They aren't sure how she related to the man Goheen met 15 years before, but according to her, the family owned all of the station land, the original 22-acre plot, and the 6 and 7 acres adjoining. After checking with county officials, Jenny was informed that the 2 smaller plots were still in university control. He wrote to the university vice president about these claims. In the meantime, however, Jean Jenny had been sending out letters to key people. She was intent on getting the station back to the university and wrote to 20 individuals in 1986 and 1987. Her husband wanted the university to purchase this land and restore the humus of the soil over the next 100 years. A new experiment at the station. In 1988, still nothing more had happened with the plots. He wasn't the only one with new ideas for this piece of land. Arnold Schultz, a forestry professor at Berkeley, had visited the site in 1982 with his agroforestry students. Agroforestry is made to break a monoculture, combining trees and shrubs with pasture land and crops, letting everything grow together. He determined for himself that Hilgard was the first agroforestry professor in the state, combining these vineyards with the oaks, manzanita, pines, row crops, and fruit trees. He thought they could turn it into a park, complete with historical information visitors could take in while they strolled around. Maybe the Department of Parks could run it. Others agreed with this. Another professor was interested in the olives and their cuttings from the site. A formal proposal was submitted by Schultz for the agroforestry station in March of 1988, about 100 years after the station was first started up. The plan was a good one, well thought out and organized, but the proposal ended with a warning about big dogs guarding marijuana plantations next door and neighbors that were hopping mad. This dimmed down everyone's excitement about the plan. Goheen, meanwhile, continued on in his pursuit. A 1985 trip was disappointing, with most of the vines he had uncovered in 1962 now dead. 1988 showed some more movement and facts coming to light that would affect everyone's plan for the old station land. Jean Jenny and others met with the Council of Deans and Directors about the station. Here's how it played out from 1903 until 1988. After the university abandoned the station, the largest tract was deeded back as agreed. In 1938, the only heir still alive deeded the plot to the town of Jackson. Jackson seemed to show no real interest in it and essentially ignored it. Isidore Orlandi filed for and won a judgment of adverse possession, squatters' rights, in 1952 against Jackson, and then deeded all 3 parcels to Catherine Fantozzi, his daughter. The university still owned the smaller parcels, but Elizabeth Holcomb, who inherited the deeds in 1977, paid taxes on them still. The university lawyers thought they could get the land back if the university wanted it, but they didn't really want it. Although the station was respected, they found little present use for it. Maybe when a San Joaquin campus was built? Eventually, a plaque was put in near the station honoring and memorializing it. Even after her husband passed, Jean Jenny kept working on behalf of the station. Apples are what did the next part. Clark Kerr, the emeritus university president, was an avid apple grower. His curiosity was piqued by the mention of these 100-year-old apple trees. This was in 1992. A committee of 7 was put together to write to potentially sympathetic parties, and a campus planner got to work on a proposal for the site. But it wasn't sent. It wasn't even finished. 1993 comes, and the fate of the station is turned over to the National Reserve System and its president, Deborah Elliott Fisk. Elliott Fisk, after receiving directions to the site, went on a tour with her vice president and then wrote a letter addressed to Mrs. K. Kerr, the emeritus professor's wife, but not someone otherwise related to our story here. The letter declared that due to the Oneto family owning the largest parcel, and the other parcels essentially unreachable without going through the larger or other private land, and that the Oneto family was not interested in selling, but they would buy the other tracts of land. In 1994, the Onetos acquired the other tracts. Some more letter writing to friends of the station continued for a couple years, but that too went away. People retired, people died, or just lost interest. There wasn't much more that could be done. One of the largest and most lasting impacts of the Jackson station are the clones now distributed by FPS. Early distributions to farmers when the station was active surely have played a part in some of the older head-trained vines that dot Amador County. Cabernet Clone 6. This is a small, loose clustered clone. Small berries give lots of tannin and a muscular wine. It famously goes into BV Clone 6. For an in-depth look at Clone 6 and the foothills in general, read Mike Dunn's book, The Signature Wines of Superior California. Sauvignon Blanc Clone 29. Originally Clone 3. Clone 29 started life at the Berkeley Experimental Central Station in 1874 before being planted at Jackson. Like the others, it grew almost wild for 50 years until saved by Goheen. 73 vines of this were planted at the Berkeley station by Hilgard. In 1890, some cuttings of the Sauvignon Blanche were taken to Jackson and planted in Block S, Row 15, vines 1 through 10. This is the cutting that Goheen believed to be Herbamont. He thought he was in Row 18. Eventually, this cutting became Sauvignon Blanc Clone 3. In 1983, leaf roll was detected in it, and after a treatment, Clone 29 was established in 2005. Pinot Noir Clones 9, 16, and 106 were acquired from the station. 106 was originally labeled Pinot Franc and Pinot St. George and were planted in the Foundation Vineyard in 1967 as Clone 29, but was never registered because of questions about its variety. Some Oregon researchers used it as part of a clonal trial, and it consistently received high marks. Due to this trial and the curiosity about this clone, it was put into testing and cleaned up to eliminate leaf roll and became available in 2006. The Jackson station is responsible for the oldest Spanish selection, Valdepeñas FPS 03, aka Tempranillo. It was originally imported into California in the 1880s. Trousseau Gris Clone 7 was originally Gray Riesling, but later changed. No cleanup was necessary on this clone. Nebbiolo Fino, No. 1, is one Jackson selection that was able to sneak through the testing. It was discovered to be the source of fan leaf virus at 2 nurseries in 1990. It could have been an error in the heat treatment, but it's still unclear. Maynard Amarine wrote about Hilgard. Although the Prohibition period removed many of the results of Hilgard's work from California vineyards, the influence of his far-reaching and systematic attack on the problems of California's grape and wine industry can still be detected today. Amarine suggested that the influence of Hilgard waned post-Prohibition because of vineyard replanting that prioritized easy-to-ship grapes or table grapes, and that many of the quality-conscious winemakers had left the industry during Prohibition. Nothing of note has happened with the station land recently. Hilgard passed away in Berkeley January 8, 1916. He wished to work from California outward, not to try to fit old theories to a new state. Thanks for listening today to the first of this two-part series. I think it's an interesting story, and although I knew the outlines of it, I learned a lot while doing the research. I'd never heard about the Hans and Jean Jenny part of the story, for example. I think the Goheen part is a little more well-known. The quote at the beginning and end is from a speech that Hilgard gave at a farmers' meeting in 1876. I tried to use primary source material whenever possible. If I made any mistakes that you know of, please let me know. I want to get it correct. Some of the quotes were condensed slightly. Folks at that time could get pretty wordy. One aspect I found interesting is that most of the grapes we think of when discussing the Sierra foothills, Zinfandel, Barbera, Mission, didn't figure very large in this part of the story at all. In some cases, they were actively trying to figure out alternatives for Mission and Zinfandel, especially Mission. Having said that, there were a lot of trials conducted with Zinfandel by the university at the time, so it's not like they hated the grape. It's an amazing undertaking to try and essentially map what will and should grow in different portions of a state so varied as California, and one that was so new at the time. It feels like even today we're trying to figure out exactly what grows best where. Charles Wetmore only appears briefly in this episode. He'll be popping up again sometime in the future. And although he and Hilgard didn't always see eye to eye, his first vintage of Cresta Blanca white wine won the grand prize at the Paris Exposition in 1889, so he knew what he was doing also. I think it goes without saying that you could probably figure out more or less where the station is on a map, but you should not try to find it in person. This episode is a bit different than what we've done in the past, but there will be a few more in a similar vein coming up. I'm going to try and dive into some more California wine history while harvest is going on to respect winemakers' time. Once harvest is wrapped, it will be mostly back to the usual again. There's a link in the notes if you'd like to see some of the photos and maps that were in the viticultural reports. The second part of this series will not be the next episode, but it will be soon. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast. And feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also now a Patreon set up if you feel like supporting the podcast monetarily to hopefully allow for more episodes, more travel, and to help defray other costs. The link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.